joining us for today's AVST Live webinar. Today we're going to be talking about disruption and disruptors in the UC market and how to future-proof. Our presenters today are Hardy Myers, President and CEO of AVST, as well as Phil Edholm of PKE Consulting. He's an industry expert. And before I turn it over to our speakers today, I just want to let you know that we are recording this, and we will make the recording available to you as well. In a follow-up email, we will make sure you get a copy of these slides if you're interested in reviewing them. And of course, we do have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session, and you're welcome to type your questions in at any time during. And of course, when we get to that point, we'll cue you as well. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning. This is Hardy Myers, CEO of AVST, and I welcome you to the webinar entitled Future Proof Your UC Strategy. We're honored to have Phil Edholm join us today, and Phil's going to deliver a lot of the meat of the presentation. I'm excited to hear his thoughts on how enterprises can future-proof their UC strategy, and then I'm going to add a little color, of course, and also highlight some of the value propositions AVST brings to the unified communications market. Next slide, please. So just as a very quick overview of AVST, apologies, we're just waiting for the slide to change. There we go. For those of you that aren't aware of who AVST is, our vision is to be the leading developer of best-of-breed unified communication software. We focus in two core areas: on the application side, mobility, team communications, business process, and of course, an area that we're renowned for in the industry around voice applications. And then, of course, interoperability is the other core competitive advantage, or what AVST is known for. Our focus traditionally has been integrating with the on-prem and cloud legacy infrastructure, or excuse me, on-prem and network legacy infrastructure. And of course, now we're working very diligently with many of the players, both in the cloud space and of course with Microsoft, as they emerge as one of the next generation leading providers of unified communications in the space. We have over 35 years of experience and thousands of customers worldwide. Our mission has remained the same over the 35-year period, which is really all about delivering best-of-breed communication solutions that transform productivity of enterprises while leveraging their existing and evolving infrastructure. And Phil's going to talk a lot about that, and all of you have that type of infrastructure scenario in your organizations today. So we're looking forward to that input. And then really around flexibility, this is again a hallmark for AVST, which is through a combination of the interoperability of our platform and the resilient scalable architecture, we're enabling enterprises to move towards centralized UC, a centralized UC stack, migrating to the cloud, and of course integrating Skype for Business into their infrastructure, all of which I'm sure Phil will have a lot to talk about. Next slide, please. And then just as we mentioned, our focus is principally around enterprise, and we understand big business. Many of the largest corporations in the world run on AVST across multiple verticals. And so we look forward to, if you're interested, having a conversation with you about AVST. When Phil is done, I will just highlight a couple of the capabilities of the AVST platform, and then we'll move right into key takeaways from both Phil and my perspective, and then open it up for questions. So with that, I'm honored to hand off the presentation to Phil. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I have one more quick section. Thank you. On the state of the market. And this is just from a highlight standpoint. There's a lot going on. Phil will highlight this as well. I'm sure many of you or all of you are aware that Avaya filed Chapter 11 earlier in the year. We view that, and this may sound a bit odd, but we view that as a positive. It sort of created some certainty around the direction Avaya was going. And we just recently came back, both Phil and I, from the Avaya Engage conference 2 weeks ago, and we're very encouraged about the direction Avaya is going from a product standpoint. And we believe that them emerging from bankruptcy in the near term should result in a very, very strong third player in the enterprise unified communication space. And we're very excited to work with Avaya, which we've been a partner of theirs for many years across multiple different areas. Microsoft, of course, their focus is principally on the cloud, and they've got this what we call the mega bundle, which is a very significant amount of capabilities that includes not only the O365 elements around the unified communication stack, but some of their other productivity applications. The good news for many of the large enterprises or medium enterprise on the phone is the shift to the cloud From an enterprise standpoint, we're defining as really 1,000 or bigger users or end users is really in its early innings. Market share is fairly low, single digits, maybe just north of that. And we clearly see hybrid cloud as something that most enterprises will be utilizing as part of their migration to the cloud strategy in the near term. You can expect to see more acquisitions and consolidations in the market. Last year was a very busy year for acquisitions and consolidations, and a lot's going on in the space. Key terms that you want to be aware of are digital, intelligence, and collaboration. Phil and I would joke that digital was before IP, but digital transformation, digital anything right now is really one of the hottest terms in the space, and so it's an area that you want to be familiar with, or the terminology you want to be familiar with. And of course, and then again, we'll highlight this as part of our conversation, security is a top budget priority for all IT organizations. So to the extent that you can leverage this requirement for security to enhance, evolve, and extend your UC infrastructure is something that you want to think about. So with that, I will now hand it off to Phil. Phil, we're honored to have you, and I'll go on mute and let you continue the presentation. Thank you.
Super, thanks, Hardy. So today, what I'd like to talk about is, how do you keep cool in a time of lots of disruption? And of course, one of the first questions that you have is, why is this person talking to me? So we jump to the next slide, please. There we go. So my name is Phil Edholm. I run a consulting company called PKE Consulting. I'm also a member of UC Strategies. My past background, I was the CTO CSO at Nortel, and I was at Avaya as the VP of Technology Strategy and Innovation. I'm generally perceived as one of the folks who created and drove the voice over IP revolution, and now the UC revolution that's happening in the industry. So I think I'm in a unique position, having lived through and seen the transformations and the changes over the past 15 to 20 years, to be able to talk about where we are today and where we're going in the future. Next slide, please. So very much, we're in a time of change. So when I put this up, anybody in the audience actually know what this means? Well, what this actually means, unfortunately, I don't have control here, so you have to mouse click for me. So this is actually the Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times," and it's something that a lot of us occasionally talk about, and we say, "May you live in interesting times," but what that actually means is now I think I have control, if I can get it to work. I always wonder about this technology, that it doesn't seem to work flawlessly.
We're collaborating, Phil. Come on.
Exactly. So I don't know if you can do a mouse click, Ann, because it's not taking my.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah, there we
go.
Okay. So, "May you live in interesting times" is actually a Chinese curse. And it's actually a Chinese curse that dates back, literally hundreds, if not 1,000 years, to a time when there was turmoil, when there was unrest, where there were interesting times. Things bad happened to people that lived in those interesting times. So, for example, if you were living in interesting times and the emperor decided to get rid of a bunch of people, you might be caught up in being gotten rid of. And I would actually make the argument that today we live, excuse me, I got a double click there, we live in very interesting times in the communication and collaboration industry. I mean, Hardy talked a bit about bankruptcy. I mean, clearly Avaya has been challenged for the last few years in terms of the marketplace, how they compete with Cisco, how they compete now more and more with Microsoft, being saddled with a huge amount of debt from the initial acquisition by private equity, the purchase of Nortel. Bankruptcy is actually potentially a way to restructure their debt position, their overall obligations, free up cash for the business, but the reality is that needs to be combined for success with new business strategies. On the other side, we have UCaaS. Clearly, UCaaS is a hot topic now. But when you look in the enterprise space, we actually see a lot of people really questioning why UCaaS makes sense. Is it cost savings? Is it investment protection? What's the logic behind doing UCaaS? But UCaaS is definitely something that more and more needs to be taken into account. Skype, as Hardy mentioned, is a huge transformation in the industry. Skype for Business comes bundled with most of the Office 365 offers. Microsoft is making it incredibly persuasive for organizations to move to Office 365, and that includes Skype for Business as part of any of the basic packages in Office 365. So the ability of organizations to adopt Skype for Business, if for some or potentially all of their communication and collaboration capabilities, is something that's really happening in the marketplace. And then we see applications like Slack. If your organization uses Slack, what you will begin to see is that Slack and other applications are beginning to provide communication and collaboration capabilities within the application. This is actually a trend that we're seeing of the real-time web and communication becoming more and more embedded in applications. The result of all of this transformation is that the core of communications is actually beginning to change. But the reality is, while we see all these new kinds of communication and we get excited about them, telephony is the key business foundation element in business today. When you tend to think about the millennials, and people say, well, millennials don't like to use the telephone. They like to use video, or they like to use text, or people are starting to use social media. But the reality is that telephony is still the way the majority of business communications gets done. If you look at telephony today, it still is a mission-critical system. In fact, I would argue it's in some ways becoming even more mission-critical with the need for people to communicate and make decisions rapidly. That real-time communication where human beings interact with speech in real time is critical to completing tasks. Literally back in the 70s, there were tests that were done by Alfonso Chapanis where he looked at how people communicate. And what he found was that when you added voice, the ability to talk to each other, to two people trying to do a task, you reduce the time to completion of the task by 70% versus other techniques like writing or drawing. The reality is interacting with each other in real time. Did you get that? Do you understand is critical. If you look at this was actually a survey that was done in 2016 by Dialpad. Picking up the phone is ranked as one of the most effective ways to communicate. Internally, it's second to email. Email is clearly taken over internally, and there are lots of discussions about whether messaging can begin to replace email internally. But if you look externally, the phone is still number one because it allows you to have that very rapid discussion with someone, get to the point quickly. What's interesting is that video is at the bottom of both of these. I think over time, video will become up and be more important externally, but it's going to take time as people get more comfortable with it. So the reality is that voice is critical. So,
and of course, Phil, it's video linked with voice, right?
It's video obviously linked with voice. So the real question then for all of us on this call is, how do you stay cool in interesting times? How do you keep from becoming someone who looks back in interesting times and say that was not good for me? Fundamentally, I think we have 5 goals that we have to think about. The first is we need to keep the phones ringing. We need to maintain telephony for our organization. Question always to ask yourself is, if telephony went away for a week in my organization, what would the impact be? I mean, if you're a hospital, it's a clear impact of what that would mean. But if you're a brokerage firm, if you're a plumbing company, regardless of who you are, retail distribution, communications and telephony is critical to your business today. You need to keep the apps running that integrate with telephony. It's very interesting. We talk a lot about things like voicemail and people saying, well, I don't use voicemail as much. But the reality is when someone calls and leaves a voicemail, it may be a very important message. So keeping those applications that are integrated with communications running is absolutely critical. Need to begin to think about how you add value. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you think about value being added in this world, because I think we tend to think, we as a group, those of us on this call, tend to think about all these great new products and tools as being just wonderful while not really thinking about the other people in our organization that are not in the same kind of roles that we are, and whether these tools really are either essential or even adding value to their jobs. We need to minimize cost. I mean, this is a time where there's a lot of folks saying, go to a new system, replace what you have. The cost of that can be incredible. And with all the uncertainty coming, whether it be cloud, whether it be things like Skype for Business, this is a time when you may want to think about using the assets you have effectively going forward. And then the final point is really eliminating disruptions. I mean, we've talked a lot about the disruptors in our industry on the previous slide, but as an organization, you need to think about how do you eliminate disruptions. And of course, the key point to all this is that telephony is in the end the mission critical value for your organization that you need to maintain. So with that, what we think of is 3 ways of essentially thinking about your communication and collaboration future. The first step is to extend what you have to make sure that it will continue to meet the fundamental needs of your organization. The second is to start thinking about how you enhance what you have today with the right capabilities for the right people in the organization. And that may be different capabilities for different people in the organization. And finally, how do you assure that the investments that you're making in extending and enhancing your current investment, those new investments will carry forward as you evolve to new technologies, whether it be cloud offers or it be something like Skype for Business. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about extend. So extending is really about first maintaining the existing telephony system. I mean, one of the things that the industry is finding is that a lot of telephony systems, if what they're doing is telephony, the reality is that the technology, the software that was introduced 5 or even 8 or 10 years ago actually works quite fine. If you're not adding new features and new functionality, if what you're looking to have is a telephone system, you can maintain an existing telephone system. That's not to say that there's not value in upgrading it, but you don't necessarily need to replace what you have, and you can maintain it in a very cost-effective way. But then what you need to think about is, how do you replace those end-of-life elements that are in the system? Because a lot of times, even though the software may be fine, for example, a server that software runs at has come to end of life, and you need to be ready to replace it. So maintaining your system, keeping all the elements up to date in a way that is maintained and supportable, especially from things like security, is critical. While you're doing that, though, the next step is you really need to plan for the future. What are your contingencies? What are you going to do as things change? One important thing I would encourage all of you to think about is to think about your organization and the types of workers you have in your organization and the communication and collaboration tools they need. So this is actually in a white paper that's on the PKE Consulting website called KISS, K-I-S-S, Knowledge Information Service Structure. And it's really a view that says that we have different kinds of workers in the workplace who need different communication and collaboration technologies and capabilities. On the far right, you see service workers. Service workers are people who basically do a job without a continual integration to an information system to tell them what to do next. So, clearly somebody on a backhoe digging a ditch is not using an information system to tell them what to dig next. But similarly, the UPS driver, the maid who cleans a hotel room, they're really not using information systems to tell them what to do step by step through the course of their day. So those service workers, while they may gather information, really are not information system integrated. Information workers, or sometimes called task workers, are people who actually do a job based on a formal business process. So for example, a field service technician gets up in the morning, opens an app up, and it tells him what his first service call is. Similarly, a contact center agent, a bank teller in a bank. These are people that actually are following an information system. Similarly, if you look at a nurse, for example, in a hospital, often falls between an information and a service worker. Then you have the last category on the left, the knowledge worker, which quite frankly, everyone on this call is probably a knowledge worker. Knowledge workers work independently. They have their own private business process. You all here at this call today because you responded to something. You got an email with an invite that was a calendar item. You put it on your calendar. You control your own time. You manage your own day. You have undefined outcomes. You're not following a prescriptive process. If you look at this kind of a thought process, what you realize is that knowledge workers spend a significant percentage of their time collaborating. Information and service workers tend not to collaborate with each other. In other words, two contact center agents are not doing a lot of collaborating with each other. What they do is they tend to collaborate when there's an exception and the system decides with an expert who's typically a knowledge worker. So understanding how your organization is structured is important, because if you look down at the bottom, you'll see even in the U.S., only about 22% of the U.S. workforce are actually knowledge workers. The majority of the workforce are information and service workers. So solutions that are really designed for knowledge workers may not have extensibility into information and service workers. And by the way, for those of you who lived through the video revolution of the early 2000s, this is very similar to what happened then. We got video in, it was used by executives, they loved it because they do a lot of meetings where they need that visual feedback to understand, am I getting commitment, am I getting buy-in? They put video systems all over the organization. Many organizations put in hundreds of video rooms, and they found the utilization was virtually zero. Because the reality is, when you look at information workers, task-oriented workers out in organizations, people who actually are doing work, they don't need video conferences to know what to do. They can do it just as effectively with the telephone. If you think about organizations, I would argue there are three kinds of organizations. At the top are services and information worker dominant organizations. So manufacturing, retail, hospitality. These are organizations where a significant percentage of the workforce are actually service workers or information workers. At the bottom, we have organizations that are predominantly knowledge workers, consulting companies, high-tech development companies who don't do manufacturing. And then in the middle, you have organizations that have a broader mix. So for example, at the top, you may only have 5 or 10% of the workforce in a large organization like a Walmart that are actually information workers, or you look at a General Motors with large manufacturing facilities. But in the middle, you see things like banking, general industry, healthcare, et cetera, where there's a wider range of users. If you then think about how we apply this next generation collaborative communication to this, what you realize is that for that first organization, that organization that really has traditional telephony for the majority of their users, the UC solution is probably only applied that next generation collaboration to the knowledge workers. At the bottom, because almost everybody's a knowledge worker, you apply it to everyone. The real challenge, though, is those companies in the middle that have a relatively large knowledge worker population, but a very large information and service worker population, and need to bring and integrate them together. So as you develop your strategy, it's very important to think about this. One of my UC strategies cohorts, Marty Parker, has actually written on UC strategy about different roles, and he's defined a number of roles in organizations, and actually will argue that there are about 9 dominant roles in organizations. Of those, only 3 are heavy-duty collaborators. The other 6 are actually much more in this information worker part of the organization. So the real question then is, how do you enhance your telephony system to deliver solutions not just for the knowledge workers, but across the organization? And I would argue that the first thing you want to think about is, how do I add enhanced capabilities that can be used by everybody in the organization? And we'll talk a bit about what those could be. But at the same time, begin to think about, how do you integrate with those personal productivity UC solutions? So these would be, solutions like Skype for Business. In the Avaya case, things like some of the Zang solutions, or say a Spark from Cisco, where people are choosing personal productivity solutions for knowledge workers, but we need to integrate that back into the telephone system, because if 80% of your users are on the left here and 20% on the right, we want to be able to bring them together effectively when they do need to interact. The enhancement capabilities really should focus less on the heavy-duty collaboration in many cases, and more on what are the things that makes communications more effective for those users that are predominantly communication users. So things like enhanced messaging, integrating with other systems, mobile integration, being able to extend your communications very, very naturally into mobile devices and enabling your users to use mobile devices and be integrated. Things like speech-enabled personal assistants, very important today as you migrate people out of the office. That field service technician who's on the road and needs to get some information, having a speech-enabled personal assistant to work with them is critical. And finally, at the bottom, how can you use call distribution to be able to manage effectively in your business to give better customer experiences? So there are things you can do to enhance where you are today and where you're going. The final step in this journey is evolve. And the thing about evolution that's very important is at some point, for many of you on this call, you will make a transition to a new option. You may transition, some of you, to Skype for Business, some of you may transition to cloud, some of you may transition to another system. A lot of those will be based on personal productivity and UC, and if you decide to do that, what's really important is to understand, can that next-gen UC or UCaaS system integrate with the replacement and new elements you brought on as you went through it, extending and enhancing your existing environment? So I'll give you a great example of how this could be for many of you to work well. One of the things that we've kind of not noticed in our industry is that voicemail, which used to be a separate server sitting on the premise, very much controlled by the enterprise, in a lot of offers now has moved off to being something that is in either in the cloud or almost more predominantly very tightly integrated with email. One of the things that's very interesting about email is that email has two characteristics that actually turn out to be very bad. The first is that there are significant retention requirements in most industries, most countries around email, and there also are significant discovery requirements. So the reality is, if you're putting your voicemails in email, those voicemails are now being retained for, in many cases, 5 years and are discoverable in any sort of legal action. And as an enterprise, the more information you have that's discoverable, the more probability is that something will be found that will create a problem, or it can be interpreted as a problem down the road. The other big problem, obviously, with email is that email can be hacked. We've seen examples of that. We saw the Sony emails that were hacked. We saw Hillary Clinton's emails that were hacked. Just imagine for a moment if Hillary Clinton's emails had included all of her voice messages over the same time. So you literally were able to get those voice messages the same time you got the email. So one of the things to look at as you begin to look at these replacement elements, going all the way back into that enhance and extend, is, how can I put those elements in place today, and what are the things I want to carry forward as I move into these next-gen systems that are unique to my business and protecting my business both from a legal perspective, but also just from a hacking perspective. If you then think about, really, sorry, we jumped there. If you think about the system for a minute, I think this little chart really represents the conundrum we are all in. This is a chart that came actually from the early aughts. I saw it probably 15, 20 years ago. And if you read it, what it says is you've received 1 attaboy. For your outstanding performance, 1,000 attaboys qualifies you to be a leader of men, et cetera, et cetera. But then if you notice, there's a line at the bottom, and the line at the bottom actually got dropped here. I don't quite know why. There's a line at the bottom that basically says 1 shit takes away all your attaboys. And the perspective on this is really simple. Telephony communications is an area where the expectation of the users is incredibly high. We have an entire, literally, society that has been trained over the past 30, 40 years that the telephone literally always works. A question I often ask people is, when was the last time you picked up a telephone and it didn't work? Mobile phones, kind of, we understand that a little bit, but a telephone, you actually probably remember it. If it's happened to you recently, you probably remember when it happened. So the reality is that this is a business where risk is great, adding value is great, but you have to be very careful not to lose the underlying value. So I would suggest that today all of you need to do 3 basic functions as you look forward. The first is develop a clear strategy. Understand UC versus telephony for your organization. Understand what the needs of your users are. Plan your 5-year capability strategy. Understand how are the capabilities you're bringing to the organization going to impact the performance of the organization. Have a clear correlation between your investments and the value they're going to create. Understand how team communications and messaging will impact your organization. Understand how products like team collaboration, whether it be a Slack product or one of the products coming out in Skype for Business or Spark or from Avaya in their Zang products, how are those going to be used? Who's going to use that? Who are the teams that would use that in your organization? Because clearly, if you're a retail organization and you've got 70 or 80% of your employees are retail employees, they're not the people that are going to use team collaboration products. But there are people in your organization that may very well use that. How will messaging change your organization? And then very much take that information and begin to analyze roles and communication and collaboration requirements. So you have a clear view of how these new technologies can be adopted in your organization, but more importantly, how do they impact the effectiveness of your organization? Then once you've got a clear strategy, plan for where you're going. How are you going to implement that 5-year strategy? What's your ongoing support? Clearly, if you have a telephony system today, maintaining that and extending it may make perfect financial sense for a number of years. Identify what are the issues you have to resolve there, components that need to be replaced, components that need upgrading, those small investments you can make that will add value. Implementing those enhancements for those telephony users. Finally, defining how you integrate with personal productivity and UC and how that long-term strategy ties into the components you're investing in today. So if you have a good map and you know where you're going, you know what your journey is, you can make sure that the investments you're making are aligned with that journey. And then finally, identify the long-term solutions with cloud or other new delivery. One of the things we don't have time to talk about today is cloud. My belief is that cloud is very much going to be a price disruptor in this industry. So understanding how you move to cloud, and as you move to cloud, again, thinking about, for example, messaging. Do you want messaging move to the cloud, or do you want to retain control over those things that actually represent information that your organization may not want out in the public domain? So the last step then is to execute, to bring your strategy and your plan into place. Implement that strategy and plan. Get those critical values into the organization quickly. Make those, call them incremental extension investments that actually enable you to provide new value and new enhancements. Minimize shadow IT. I think very much shadow IT is a challenge. Shadow IT has the potential of losing information, losing control of data that's critical and important to your organization. I think it also has the danger that as shadow IT develops, for example, it runs on your IP network. As your IP network begins to experience issues caused by shadow IT, then the network gets blamed, not the shadow IT. Well, this works fine at home, but it doesn't work at work. Well, clearly it doesn't work at work because we have firewalls to protect us at work, and that's impacting this application that you're trying to use. And then the last point is very important. Just always look at delivering quality. Don't end up being the person that gets the aw shit and the whole system comes down for 2 or 3 days. So to me, these are the very important points that you need to look at as you move forward. And with that, I'll throw it back to Hardy, and I think Hardy's going to talk a bit about how AVST's products and technologies can assist you in this journey.
Thank you, Phil. And clearly that line of business, making sure that you're identifying those applications coming in from the line of business, you need to make sure your strategy is aligned to capture that and move forward with a well thought out process to execute on implement those. So from an AVST standpoint, we clearly believe we can help you enable your 3E future proofing strategy. Just to highlight for you some of the functionality we have that's core to our platform. On the next slide, please. Phil talked about, of course, the criticality of interoperability and integrating some of these advanced UC solutions and platforms with your legacy infrastructure. That's an area, of course, we have tremendous expertise and experience. On the voice side, of course, mission criticality. Phil talked about that both from a call completion or a call processing standpoint, as well as a messaging standpoint. And again, these are areas which we have tremendous medium and large enterprise expertise. And this is where we see back to the Attaboy versus the Ashit. We see that being a very common occurrence in relatively recent history, where customers get moving forward in a certain direction, and some of these core applications are left behind or not considered when they start to migrate to some of the more advanced UC solutions. So this is an area, again, that we can help smooth that path and smooth your evolution. And then the thing that I want to just leave on this slide for AVST is really, we're experts, again, in best-of-breed mobility solutions and also team communications and business process. All areas where you can get enhanced productivity today while you continue to develop your strategy, both for evolving your existing infrastructure as well as migrating to the cloud. And then, of course, from a delivery standpoint, with AVST, we strive to really be the any company of UC, which means you can consume our technology on-prem in a hybrid configuration, from the cloud, change your mind, et cetera. And so those are all areas that we're quite happy to have a conversation with any of you that might be interested. Next slide, please. And this next slide just highlights for you, when I talk about our expertise in interoperability, what we're talking about here is really, across multiple different areas of infrastructure in your organization, not only just call control, which is an area, of course, or PBX that we've been experts in for many, many years. But again, in email, there's really no other company out there in the UC industry that integrates with more email systems and can more easily enable an enterprise to migrate from, say, an Exchange on-prem to an O365 cloud email environment. And of course, relative to mobile devices and IM and presence, instant messaging presence, we support all the most commonly deployed solutions in the enterprise. Next slide, please, Ann. So I won't cover these in great detail, but these 7 questions on these next 2 slides, you can really replace AVST in these and ask these questions for yourself. These are really good planning questions because they highlight for you areas that you may be vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, what I mean is you may have certain elements of your workforce that require new solutions to do their job, consistent with Phil's talking about the 3 different types of workers. And also, you are dealing with the criticality of some of your systems being end-of-life. They need to be replaced. You need to expand your productivity. You may be acquisitive and have multiple different elements of infrastructure, and you need to move towards a centralized solution. These are all questions that, again, AVST has great answers to, but these are also, from your perspective, really good questions for developing that strategy that Phil impressed upon you was so critical for developing your future roadmap for UC. So, Ann, if we could just jump one more slide, please, to 28. And so I'll just leave it with this, and then we'll open up for questions, and we appreciate your time today. 4 key takeaways. And so, number 1, address and leverage your short-term security and compliance issues. And I view this both as a weakness and an opportunity. And what I mean by that is you probably have some elements of your UC stack that are running on, as Phil alluded to, end-of-life server platforms. Those are a vulnerability for you from a security standpoint. We talked about the fact that security is the #1 IT priority in most medium and large enterprises. So leverage that security budget to get some of this, to eliminate some of these weaknesses in your infrastructure. Along with that, of course, whatever you do, you should expect to get more than what you had before. And of course, relative to the AVST platform, this is an opportunity for you to drive productivity by adding new best-of-breed UC capabilities. So whether it's implementing a communication-enabled business process, deploying mobility for certain elements of your workforce, adding speech-enabled personal assistant to help your mobile workforce, et cetera, those are all things that you can do while you're mitigating or eliminating some of these potential security weaknesses you have in your organization. Future-proofing is a critical value proposition you want to have, or you want to have as part of your strategy. Foundational from my perspective, which is, you may not know where you're going, but whatever you do, whatever investments you make, you're going to want to be able to respond to the question of, did we plan for this? And the answer is yes, we did. We can migrate to wherever we want to, whenever we want to, and that's a very important value proposition. And then, from a cloud standpoint, this is, again, to Phil's point earlier, you know, why are you doing it? When are you doing it? Which elements of your stack are you going to migrate? And then, of course, my final piece of advice here is, whatever you do, make sure you pilot it before you do it. And you know, that's not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. And clearly, from a sales standpoint, salespeople don't want to talk about piloting. But I would recommend to you that no matter what you do, before you consider migrating thousands of users onto a new application that you demand or request of the vendor, that they pilot the technology to make sure that, in fact, it does what they say it will do. And they being me, of course, AVST as well in that mix. I'm saying all vendors should be able to be prepared to and ready to support you in that testing process to make sure that the application meets your requirements. And with that, I will hand it off back to Ann for questions. Thank you very much.
Right,
and
thanks,
again,
Hardy.
appreciate your time.
Thanks, Phil, as well. Okay, yeah, we do have a couple of questions in the queue already. If you'd like to submit a question, go ahead and do that. If you don't see the question box, use the orange arrow in the upper corner, and that will expand your options. First question, at the beginning, it was mentioned that the Avaya news is a positive to AVST. Can you expand on that?
I didn't say that it was a positive to AVST. I said we viewed it as a positive, and I was referring to both Phil and myself. What I meant by that is I believe that prior to the bankruptcy filing, that customers were not sure what Avaya was going to do. And I don't work for Avaya, and I'm not speaking for Avaya here. This is my personal opinion. And that, you know, there was some discussion about possibly breaking the company apart and selling off the contact center business and whatnot. And I think just that uncertainty about where Avaya was going led customers to pause. And you know, we have a lot of complementary channel, and we have a lot of complementary customers with Avaya, and we clearly believe that you know, caused customers just to step back and say, we're going to wait and see what happens. So I believe that, you know, clearly there's some customers that a bankruptcy filing is not a great answer, and for those, of course, Avaya has said, and I'm sure they are working very diligently to get out of bankruptcy as fast as possible so they can get back to doing business. But for a lot of customers who maybe were waiting to do upgrades or whatnot, I think that now that Avaya is in Chapter 11 and they're working to get out of it very quickly, I think that'll give them the confidence to move forward with the upgrading of their infrastructure and move forward with their plans. So again, this wasn't about a positive for AVST. It was more about a positive I viewed from a customer standpoint, that there's clarity. And you know, we heard again at Avaya Engage last week, or 2 weeks ago, excuse me, a very solid presentation from the senior leadership at Avaya about their plans and where they're going, both from a product standpoint as well as getting out of this bankruptcy situation. And as Phil mentioned, we both view that as you know, potentially being a very positive, but not only for the industry, but for Avaya and their customers.
Yeah, and this is Phil. I would say very much that, you know, it was inevitable that one of two things had to happen with Avaya. Either one, you know, a major part of Avaya had to be sold off, or Avaya had to go through bankruptcy and restructure. You know, essentially, what we referred to, and you heard the words capital structure. The words capital structure means how much debt you're carrying. The debt that Avaya was carrying was last year was $450 million of interest. That requires you to make a huge amount of what's called EBITDA, which is your earnings before taxes and other things. The reality is Avaya has been for the past 5 years struggling to try to understand and doing essentially the same strategy because they've been trapped by that debt. They were not able to sell the contact center. I don't know that I actually see that as a bad thing. Quite frankly, I think it would have been very, very disruptive to the customers, to the business, to the channels, where you actually had the contact center customers who were, quite frankly, predominantly dependent upon the underlying Avaya communication platform, now seeing those products in 2 different companies, potentially with 2 different goals, et cetera. So from the perspective of Avaya stepping forward and saying, we have a problem, we have to solve it now, I think it's absolutely the right thing. The second is that I think that it will enable Avaya to actually revisit their top-level strategy. You know, clearly the strategy of the last 5 years, which has resulted in about 6% per year of annual revenue declines, has not been a strategy that has been successful. The problem is that changing that strategy under the previous capital structure was virtually impossible. So going forward, they now have the chance under a new capital structure, probably with a new management structure with that, and new private equity firms that are involved in the what I refer to as adult supervision of the company, I think you can see some new strategies. I think there's an opportunity for Avaya to really change their strategy and to become what I think most of us in the industry want, which is an effective competitor, really demonstrating a capability to meet the needs of a certain percentage of the marketplace. So I do see it as very much being positive. The challenge for Avaya now, and actually I just wrote an article about this that was on, I think we came on a Jitter probably this morning, really is getting the creditors to agree rapidly on how Avaya emerges and what the capital structure looks like, what the allocation is to the different levels of debt holders, in a way that happens very quickly and gets the company out where it has enough degrees of freedom to be able to really change its position in the marketplace. So personally, I think it's absolutely the right thing to happen. The alternative was just a continued decline with a strategy that wasn't winning in the marketplace.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I think we have time for at least one more question here. Do you still see total cost of ownership as an important part of the UC strategy?
Phil, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I'll take it first. Clearly, total cost of ownership is a very important part of any buying decision. The reality is, I am one of those people. Everything to me is math and numbers, and I actually consider total cost of ownership in everything I've ever bought in my life. My wife and I, at one point in our life, had some money, and I decided to buy a used 911 Porsche. And as I was going through the process of buying, and I thought about how much I might use the car, it was an extra car, a third car. It was basically a Saturday fun car. I realized that every time I touched the door handle, it was going to cost me $20. So my total cost of ownership analysis, just about buying a car, was very much that way. I think total cost of ownership is absolutely critical and will continue to be critical. And quite frankly, one of the challenges in cloud is, while in other industries, take CRM for example, cloud has had a dramatic impact on TCO. If you did a Siebel CRM seat in 2004, the cost to deploy that in a typical enterprise was $5,000 to $10,000 per seat. When you looked at the cost of the software, the cost of the servers, the cost of the people administering, the cost of support, all those different components together, you can now buy Salesforce for $60, $70 a month. So that, say $7,000 has come down to $700 or $800. So it's been a dramatic reduction. If you look at cloud in the communications business, cloud today typically costs the same or even more than premises. I think we're going to begin to see that cost modeling change, and total cost of ownership is decreasing, and I think becomes an important part of your strategy. Again, as you look at your 5-year plan, TCO becomes critical, and TCO can very much be optimized by using the existing assets you have. Buying again, coming back to the simple things we all understand. If I have a 3-year-old car, I look at it and I say, well, gee, it's costing me money to maintain this car now. But if you look at the cost of driving that car for the next 3 years versus going and buying a new car and replacing that 3-year-old used car, if you look at the end of the 3 years at what you paid to have a car to drive, I can guarantee you absolutely it will cost you significantly more to have had a new car than to have kept your used car. So I think, again, TCO needs to be considered in all of your evaluations, keeping existing assets, maintaining them, and then adding value on top of them is always going to be more cost effective than replacing those assets with something completely new. Anyway, to you, Hardy, as well.
I have one other comment. Yeah, just a couple comments. So one of the things we see quite often is, and this is something that everyone needs to be, this is why TCO is so important. You need to do what Phil was talking about, which is run the model out 3 to 5 years and make sure you capture all the maintenance costs. So if you're talking about a prem solution, of course, it's the initial outlay of the equipment and services plus the upgrades over 5 years plus the maintenance. And what I mean by that is that sometimes there's sort of a loss leader where you get in on a very low threshold to acquire the technology, and then the maintenance, for 5 years is a very material part of the TCO calculation. So don't just look thinking it's apples to apples on a 1-year type scenario. You really need to run that out and run that TCO. So I would second what Phil said, which is TCO is very critical and will remain critical no matter what. And you may decide to go to the cloud for flexibility reasons, et cetera, and also I would second what Phil said, which is particularly right now with as much disruption in our space and evolution, if you will, and change. I'm not sure if I'm running a large enterprise, I'm not sure I'm clear what the direction is I want to go. So it's probably best to focus on how do I get the productivity apps that my employees need today, upgrade my existing infrastructure potentially, and in many cases an upgrade is really a replacement. I mean, as Phil would, I'm sure, concur, when you're taking, it may be the same physical piece of equipment, but the software is all state of the art and been R&D's been ongoing for years. So those are just a couple of considerations.
Yeah, just one final comment on that. I would also suggest that for those of you who are looking at these next generation technologies, think not just about TCO, but almost more importantly about ROI, because as you move away from what I will call, for lack of a better word, utility systems. Telephony is to a great extent a utility system. You have to have it. It doesn't in of itself, having a telephone and being able to make telephone calls, give your business strategic advantage. As you begin to look at some of these other technologies we've talked about, whether they be the traditional UC technologies, the collaboration technologies, added functionality, just looking at cost and comparing solutions on cost doesn't address the issue in many organizations that new investments need to have an ROI. So you need to begin to understand what is the benefit and the impact on the organization that this new technology or tool will have. What are the cost savings going to be? What's the new revenue generation? So I think for many of us on this call, going beyond TCO, which was traditionally a telephony or utility purchase measurement, to actually looking at ROI, understanding what will this mean to my organization, how will it change the way we do business, is going to be critical as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil and Hardy. We'll go ahead and wrap it up at this point. There was a couple of questions about getting the presentation slides, and so I'll just let you know one more time. In the follow-up email that we send later today, we will include a link to download the slides as well as the recording of this session. And want to thank our presenters once again, Phil Edholm and Hardy Myers, for a great discussion. And thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. And we look forward to seeing you on another AVST Live webinar at some point. And have a great day, everyone.
To learn more about AVST, please visit www.avst.com.